We're back for season 6 of my podcast. I'm all about putting the human factor back into business by helping organisations become places where people are happy, well, and able to perform at their best. And that's what my guests shed light on with their expertise and experience. As those who know me will be very familiar with, my mantra is simple: get people right, get business right. And that means we'll be covering a whole range of topics that impact on employee experience, engagement and mental well-being. And many of you will know that I hate tick boxes. So we'll be kicking those out, getting beneath the surface of shiny new initiatives, stripping back layers of complexity and going back to the fundamentals of good business. That's the people. This series runs alongside the launch of Leadership Labs and Manager Labs that I'm excited to be facilitating with the fabulous Gemma Ellison of Heart Leadership. These are interactive and dynamic communities that turn typical L&D on its head. If you are a manager or leader and want an opportunity to problem solve, challenge the status quo, experiment and evaluate, all within a small supportive group, get in touch. More information and contact details are in the podcast notes. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist, psychotherapist and founder of It's Time for Change. Thank you for joining me on Beyond the Water Cooler. Today, we're looking at the impact of employee investigation processes on individuals and organisations. And I met my two guests who are joining me at the Annual Association of Business Psychologists Conference in May. So Andrew Cooper is head of the Avoidable Employee Harm Programme and Adrian Neal, head of the Employee Wellbeing Service at, and I'm going to have to try and say this right, Aneurin, Bevan, University Health Board, yay, NHS Wales. I knew I wouldn't have got that right when I said it originally off air. So welcome to the show, both of you. I'm really pleased to have both of you here and to have two guests. So this could be an interesting conversation with big pauses or us all talking over top of each other. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Lisa.
You have both studied the harm that HR processes can do to the workforce, and you've been able to draw out key messages that we can all learn from. And that's what we're going to unpick a little bit today. But before we get into that, I would love you both to say a little bit more about how you got into doing what you're doing. So why it is that you're focusing on this particular aspect of work. So should we start with you, Adrian?
I'm a clin psych by trade, and about 10-ish years ago, I kind of moved over into organizational psychology, and my thesis at the time was looking at the impact of a very poorly carried out organizational change process. So I think I was already then thinking about how organization that was in the NHS, how they often unwittingly cause problems for people, make things harder, create waste, and actually create harm, although I hadn't actually thought about it in that format. Fast forward a handful of years, and Andrew and I met when he was in a previous role, and with an interest in quality improvement. And we got talking about how could we improve processes to minimize essentially make things more efficient, but actually really to minimize the damage that some of these processes unwittingly cause. And we both knew there was high relevance. I guess another parallel thread was in my role as head of employee wellbeing, just seeing either myself or my team seeing just way too many people that had been involved in these processes, battered and bruised, and often wanting to leave. So the whole range is, in many ways, those three kind of parallel stories then formed around some very early thinking around this piece of work, and Andrew has been absolutely pivotal in making this happen. So I'll stop talking there and hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Adrian.
So my background has been in communications marketing, and I was involved in a patient safety campaign within NHS Wales a number of years back. And the work on the patient safety campaign really introduced me to the concept of harm, introduced me to the potential for quality improvement, to change. And then I started talking to Adrian a number of years back about how we could perhaps apply that to other processes that go on within organisations. So that had been established in terms of the patient safety movement, but actually what about other processes that were perhaps impacting our staff and employees quite detrimentally? Could there be any learning and approaches that could be drawn across from that world into the HR employee wellbeing world?
And it was really interesting because I heard you talk about avoidable patient harm within the NHS when you talked about that at the conference, but it was so evident that the principles that you're talking about really apply to all organisations. And you know, when you just listen to someone, you're like, wow, we are so on the same page, because this is a lot of what I talk about with companies that I work with. But you had such lovely examples of kind of what you've discovered and actually the difference it can make. So I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that. But it is relevant, isn't it? As in, it's not just something that's in the NHS.
Certainly. And if you look at the patient, the journey of the patient safety movement, which is recognised as being 20, 30 years old, it needs to start with an acknowledgement we aren't doing things as well as we thought we were. So certainly within patient safety, leading healthcare professionals started saying, whilst people go in to do a great job of work, our systems are conspiring against us, we could do things better. And the patient safety movement grew with an honest conversation around identifying what those areas were, and then looking at building interventions to address them. And that's been the journey of the last 30 years with the patient safety movement, looking to apply those. I think every time Adrian and I talk about avoidable employee harm, we just realise we're at the beginning of the journey, but actually it gives really helpful language to start shaping conversations to doing things different and hopefully better.
And you know what, I love what you just said about it starts off with just simple, good conversations, honest conversations. Because I was picked up recently for just saying I just have conversations. It's often just about starting conversations. And someone said to me, it's not just, you know, these conversations are really important. But for me, it's when I say just, it's actually let's just talk about what we already know within the room, rather than just piling on lots of other stuff and hoping it might hit the spot, which often it doesn't. So what I'd love to explore a little bit now is what we actually mean by the term employee harm, because lots of people will be hearing that thinking, well, what do we actually mean by that?
So we've recently published a paper, which is our first academic piece to draw this stuff together, but it all centers around a case study, and you know, this paper is kind of 4 years plus in the making, so super pleased to get it out there, and we can share links for your viewers. And I guess in that paper we start to map out what the harm is, and the assumption is that it was avoidable. But if you start to look at that, so our initial, and me being a clinician at heart, the initial focus was the individual, and that's the obvious place to start, because that's often the visible bit, although ironically, while these processes are going on, actually that's not very visible at all because of the noise and the processes. But if you divide up or rather take a kind of 360-degree look at an individual case, what you see is there's let's just call it psychological harm to an individual, or the potential for that. We know that is documentable, it's evidenced, it's very real. And we know at the mild end, it's a kind of cluster of anxiety and fear and distress and discomfort. And at the extreme end, it's illness, it's disease, it's trauma in a diagnostic sense, and it's potentially suicide. So I think our case study doesn't go into that depth, but it talks about levels of clinical need. But there are there are examples, sadly, in the media where people caught up in the stuff have sadly taken their own lives. So that's the spectrum of the individual. But then you step back and you start to look at, okay, well, there's the individual, there's their family, there's their system, there's the working environment and the team or the system they worked within, because these processes often take months, not days. So there's the chronic impact on those systems. There's the effect on local, I guess, local engagement, their well-being. There are factors like psychological safety, the things that really mess with how teams feel safe. There's the impact on the wider culture of the organization, because these things are never straightforward. People know people, everyone talks. So it very quickly, you start to see this ripple effect of impact. We also know there's a financial impact. We've done, and Andrew is definitely better at the detail than I am. We've done some calculations around the financial and economic impacts just of a scenario. There's impact on the reputation of the organization, and it's once you start asking, it's literally like you lift a stone and you go, oh, there's something there, oh, there's something there. So you suddenly get this very wide, diffuse range of impacts, which, if you go right back to the original, the epicenter, if you like, if it's avoidable, I mean, it's diabolically wrong, because why would you do that to anybody or any system? And which organization has enough resources to cope with that kind of insult, if you like? So at multiple levels, this is not good business, and this is morally wrong as well.
And I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I was part of a Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce webinar a few months ago where we were talking about suicide, and it happened to be the week that Ruth Perry, the head teacher, tragically took her own life. And you just think that, the implications of that for the how far those ripples spread. But it took something like that to happen before people really stood up and started saying they're going to refuse letting Ofsted in their school and so on. But for so many years prior to that tragic event, people had been saying there is lots of damage being done by that process for various reasons. And that's why your term avoidable harm, employee harm, is so, it fits so well, because, as you say, it is so avoidable. And actually we have that, a lot of employers will talk about bottom line, but it's about your moral responsibility for treating people well. So I completely hear what you're saying. It is avoidable.
There's something about the process as well, in terms of Adrian talks about turning a stone, and kind of lots of things come from underneath it. I think there's this idea, certainly with disciplinary investigations and probably other HR processes, because they are confidential in nature and they're happening in one part of the organisation, and there's a high degree, rightly so, of confidentiality around it because of the people involved and because of the situation. But actually, somehow that confidentiality wrapped over just the whole process and the concept and the thinking behind it. And then actually what we've tried to do is look at that process and concept and look at it in a very different way. And I think that wasn't happening, and generally doesn't happen, because nobody touches those kinds of areas because just of all the sensitivities. But actually, when you do start looking and start just turning a stone there, and kind of the understanding grows with it. So, we very much did start with the person at the centre, but we've had HR colleagues say to us, this is the worst part of the job. And it's like, what impact is it having on them? The staff side representatives will say how difficult they find it being caught between a member and the organisation, and kind of broaching those conversations. And then colleagues who are leading the investigation, they are left kind of holding the tension between delivering the process correctly and ensuring a duty of care to the individual. And sadly, because that's sometimes just an impossible situation, they'll go down on one side or the other, and often it'll be down on delivering the process, because that's what they're going to get measured on. And our work has been to try to bring that process and people together to make sure that they sit side by side, and not the over focus on process to the exclusion of all else.
Just picking up on Andrew's point there, and another important thread is this is not unique to the NHS, but it certainly is a key part of health systems. Is, you know, we absolutely need to be systems where we can learn from mistakes, and we can learn from errors, and we can learn from poor practice. Now, in my mind, that's just learning can only take place in a environment where people are willing to admit wrong or explore what happened. So in my mind, it's not just avoidable harm to individuals and systems and finances. This actually also starts to knock on the door of harm to patients, because we don't learn. We miss opportunities for learning how things went wrong. When people stop raising concerns or shut things down or you know, cover up because they fear what might happen to them when HR get hold of the information, which is a horrible thought, but that threat, I think, can paralyze a system, and there's always a patient that will suffer at the end of that.
That's a really good point. And I think it kind of highlights the importance of a phrase you used, which is about the shift in focus from delivery process to how do we deliver. And it's just a subtle change of words, but it's really putting the focus back on the how. Like, it's actually it's almost put the human back into those processes, isn't it?
But also the why.
Yeah.
You know, why are we doing this? Is this the right tool to do the job? And I think what we're hearing is we're slowing things down, giving people permission to ask, is this the right tool to do the job? What are you trying to get out of this? Whereas often you just pick up the biggest hammer in the toolbox, and what we're learning, and that becomes normal. And just, yeah, deeply unhelpful, but you know, almost unavoidable until you draw attention to it and start motivating people to question and think differently.
We're really looking, I guess, as well to helping staff have more mature, sophisticated conversations around this as well. So we've done a training event that we've rolled out to a few hundred people now. And as part of that training event, we share a case study of a nurse that has made an error, and we share it and ask the room, we'd like you to read it, and then we'd like you to tell us what you're going to recommend. And it's interesting, the number of times that we've run it, the room breaks into two, and what we called the two groups are the law group and the grace group. And the law group reads the case study, clearly picks up on the error that's been made, and decides this needs to go down a formal route of a formal investigation. And the conversations we've been having this work is much more about culture than even about HR processes. And then the second group, we've called them the grace group. They start asking questions about, well, what was going on? What was the background? What was the context? What was the nurse facing at the time? And then clearly ends up with a much rounder conversation and is enabled to make a much better decision, not just for the individual, but for the organisation, and ultimately for patients going forward as well, so that actually the focus becomes a learning experience rather than an opportunity, or certainly a case that our law group would want to punish. Now, we recognise in all this there are cases which really need to go down a formal route because there's been major negligence, major harm. But our recognition is that most people come into work to do a great job. They want to do the best. They want to bring the best of themselves to work. And often what our processes don't consider are the impact on the system of that, the system of an organisation on that approach. So it's those conversations, Lisa, that you mentioned at the beginning is really key for taking this forward and having better outcomes as a result of those processes. So I guess in terms of the processes that we put people through, for the legal approach, and our HR team who've been incredibly passionate about this work often start with the question, what is the ultimate outcome from this exercise? Is this a very clear set approach because there's major negligence and this could lead to dismissal? Or is the outcome, we wouldn't see this person losing their job as a result of this error? How do we go about doing it differently? So if it is that latter, we don't expect people to lose their job as a result of this exploration, then there's 101 better ways to take that individual through a process in terms of to learn from it, to perhaps acknowledge the error, but then to actually grow from it. So we have an individual that's been supported through a challenging time in their career, that we acknowledge perhaps the part that the system has played in terms of that situation. And then we've got somebody potentially reintegrated into the organisation with much improved learning, a great attitude because the organisation has treated them as an individual and recognised everything that has gone on, and that can actually take them forward. And that's the whole kind of well-being in terms of through a process like this. What's the outcome that we want? What do we want to achieve? And then that gives us great staff that have learned, that have journeyed through it, and can potentially be compassionate and graceful to others.
I wonder also, Andrew, if we can, so that would absolutely be the desired outcome. But in my mind, a lot of clinicians that make errors did not want to make the error in the first place. They're not willfully, well, let's just say they all don't want to make the errors, because if they do, there's a separate issue. That's not what we're talking about. But people will be distressed by errors, but they will also want to know why they made them. And if it's a human error, if it's to do with fatigue or to do with something very tangible and clearly located in the individual, then actually let's understand it. And there may be work to be done. There may be things to mitigate that. But actually, if it's a system issue, then the system, a process in that system needs to be addressed. And you could say, well, if we just get the hammer out and bash every staff that makes a mistake, you never find out that the common denominator may well be something very process-based in how the work is designed on the shop floor, on the ward floor. So I think by slowing it down and by both introducing a significant amount of kind of moral compass to this process, but you're also looking at, well, is there improvement here? Can we do things better for that individual, but also for what we do? Is this a product of how we design things? And I think, if you were to, the NHS, most of our practices have not just been arrived at, they've evolved and changed and shifted over years and years and years. I think if we were to reset everything and start it again tomorrow, we'd probably do things very differently. So there's a lot of practice that has to be looked at, has to be aired, has to be questioned. So I see this as a way of supporting that process as well.
And I'm curious to think about how we help organisations move from a position of blame, because it's almost like our human default setting is cover up or find fault, if it's someone who's to blame. And there's so much work that's been done on psychological safety, and people are much more aware of that now. But actually, to really make a cultural change, rather than just saying, we're going to stop blaming each other, we're going to start using errors and mistakes as a learning opportunity, is saying it and doing it's very different. What would your advice be to organisations, to leaders who are really seriously interested in shifting from a position of blame to one that is more about compassion?
So I think a lot depends on how you would define compassion as a cultural thing. I guess humans are a tricky bunch, aren't we? We have a capacity for immense care, love, support, compassion, but incredible cruelty as well. So we're definitely tricky. I guess my mind, how do you end up with a blame culture? How do you end up where blaming an individual becomes the default position? And I think that doesn't arrive overnight. I think those are often the product of other cultural components which often just simmer around. But I'm reminded of some of the, I mean, it is probably entering into pop psychology a bit, but some of the more visible work of Zimbardo. Obviously, there's the Stanford prison stuff, which is a bit dodgy, but some of the more recent stuff is a bit more credible. But a quote that I always stay with is if you have bad apples, then you have bad barrels and bad barrel makers. So there's a sense of blame doesn't make sense systemic to explain an issue systemically, but it may be a convenient organizational defense and organizational response to mitigate something else. So where you got blame, there's always got something else is going on, and you probably can't just stop that. You've got to engage in some form of cultural change process, and it starts with everyone going, we've got this wrong. And I think we're beginning to get into that place in this specific area, which I think we couldn't have got where we've got without that awareness of, okay, we've got to do things differently. But once you've got that awareness, then you can start to think, well, what does compassion look like? And I wonder if compassion is simply if you look at it from underneath, if you remove threat as much as possible, you may end up with compassion by default.
I like that.
Sorry, Andrew.
There's something around as well, starting small, I guess, in terms of the question was as well. The question was around how do you make the change or start making the change, and culture is just a massive area to know where to start. I think what's been quite helpful with this work and programme, we've started in one particular area. I'm going to take us back to the patient safety movement and kind of say, the way they identified healthcare associated infections, or whether they identified sepsis, and they worked on those individual pieces of work, kind of bringing learning together around them, building pace around it. And then when you actually put all those areas together, that's what contributed to a change and a seismic change in terms of patient safety and the movement to drive change. So I guess what we are seeing with this piece of work, we're starting with employee investigations. We've identified the harm, we've seen the impact, we've built some interventions around it to start driving that change forward. But I guess that's why it sits under that avoidable employee harm umbrella, because there will be other things that we will want to start looking at. Perhaps the impact of organizational change on individuals, if it's not done well, I think is incredibly damaging. How do we create speaking up cultures so that actually perhaps we're starting with parts of the jigsaw? How do you make a change in terms of one area, learn from it, then how do you apply it to another? So, and that's, I guess, how the patient safety movement grew, and that's kind of where we'd like to see this work grow. It's about identifying those areas where we know there's high harm impact that we can do something about, that we can learn and move forward. It's interesting, in NHS Wales at the moment, there's a major focus on compassionate leadership, and we talk about that in terms of the training day. And of course, Adrian's kind of touched on just the complexity of compassion, what it looks like, what it feels like, how it works. And when we talk about compassionate leadership in terms of employee investigations, usually more than one person will say, oh, does that mean we got to go soft on people? Is that what you're saying? And then actually, no, what we are saying is, certainly as the way compassionate leadership is explained, there's key elements around listening, empathizing, understanding, attending. So those very practical tools help people make a better decision around the next steps to take forward. So with an investigation process, if we've got our investigating officers and colleagues that are leading it, stopping to attend, to listen, to empathise, then the outcome will obviously be very different from somebody who just shoots from the hip and says, this is where we're going to go with it. The outcome may be incredibly hard and challenging for the person, but the process by which they've got to it is far more thought through and compassionate as a result. And that's kind of taking that whole piece of work by Michael West around compassionate leadership and applying it, is really trying to ground it as well.
And I like what you said about almost treating it like a jigsaw puzzle and starting with one piece, because I remember going back a number of years and people would be doing lots of different things, lots of different places in an organisation, weren't really talking to each other, and it was all a bit messy. And then people stood back and said, well, actually, what we need to do is make sure we're doing everything as a whole organisation. But then it becomes so overwhelming. It's like you were saying, when you talk about culture, firstly, what does that actually mean? We're all talking about it from in a different perspective, but actually, where on earth do you start? And how do you approach that? And how do you measure that? How do you communicate that? Just big how. And I'm such a fan of actually just zooming in somewhere, knowing that if you change one part of a system, it will have that ripple effect. And when you can find, my advice to people when they say, where do we start, is actually just find the right people who are behind the idea, who believe in it, who want to make a difference. Start by having those conversations and then just make that change there, and then look at how to, build out from that based on what you find, communicating that, seeing the relevance for others. Just starting small rather than you've got to do it as a whole organization and everyone's got to be on the same page at the same time, because I think that paralyzes people into just not doing anything.
There's certainly been something about the work that we've started, certainly working with HR. HR led this work, and we've been working with them. We kind of say it's the first time that wellbeing and HR work together, and we kind of feel a little embarrassed about that. Why on earth haven't we been working together before? But a key part of certainly the training we developed around this was a recognition that this isn't just a HR issue, that it's broader. So bringing the right people around the table changes the conversation. So as you'd expect, if you just have HR colleagues talking about a disciplinary process, it's going to be one kind of focus on it. If you bring in well-being, it changes again. If you bring in staff side in terms of their union representatives, and certainly I think what's been one of the strengths around it is those conversations across those different groups. I've actually discovered, and I know it's corny, but almost there's more agreement than disagreement in terms of the group, because actually everybody's aiming to get the best outcome for the individual and for the organisation. And that opportunity to work together, I think, has been quite key to this work.
But I also think you just said something really important there about the embarrassment factor, because I think a lot of leaders who I talk to and managers actually they feel embarrassed that they haven't got stuff right. Maybe because it sounds obvious in theory, it sounds simple, or maybe it's just because there's been a lot of talk about it and it's like, well, surely we should have got this sorted out by now. And that ability to be honest and say, actually, I know I should be doing it, but I just haven't got around to it yet, or I don't know where to start, or I just don't have the knowledge and skills to do anything with it. And I love just that honesty about the first time HR and wellbeing are really talking to each other. And so many organizations haven't made those connections, and they know they should be. And, there's often the right intention, but creating the space to look at how do we make those connections and how do we have the conversations we need to have. That's the bit that gets squashed, removed from our week when we're under a huge amount of pressure, as we know NHS is. So I love that honesty, just that sense of embarrassment.
I think just to pick up on that, and this is really, it's funny how you have conversations 100 times and then another conversation, you go, oh yeah, penny drops. Just thinking about some of the magic ingredients. So we've approached this as a kind of behavioral change program, but in a light way, in that we were looking to motivate people. So we wanted people to see the relevance, no matter where they were. So these big events have helped do that, because the relevance is very clear, the evidence is very clear. But we've also, I guess, helped them see a way forward and consider options, very tangible things they could do. But the third bit, I think, is the bit you've just kind of touched on, is that we've not come at it from a moral, from atop a big moral hill looking down. We've approached it as a collaborative exploration, and we've deliberately kept away from being the smug experts, and welcomed as much kind of inclusive communication as possible from the various professional groups, and by doing so, I think we've probably indirectly avoided any shaming, kind of naming and shaming. We've kind of not, I think and it's probably not a design thing, but it's probably an artifact of just how we operate. But we've not gone on to change their behavior, but through shame.
Yeah, and that's so powerful. It's that sense of, it's the trust, isn't it? In terms of, I often talk about, I'll just be there to have a chat with or hold your hand on that journey or whatever. I'm not going to be coming and telling you how to do stuff. I was talking to someone recently and saying that a company decided I wasn't for them because they wanted me just to come in with a off-the-shelf program and do the thing. I was like, I'm not going to be doing anything to anyone. I'm going to come in and help you on your journey, which means you've got to invest the time and the effort and the want into doing this, which isn't for everyone. But that trust and just knowing that people can be very honest and open and they're not going to be judged. And, as soon as you let the guards down, it's like, that's when you come across the real valuable nuggets of information that can just change the course of everything. It just changes all those processes, just changes how we do stuff. It's so powerful. Tell me a little bit more about Alex. So in terms of when I read your there's the case study that you've written up in the British Journal of Healthcare Management, and that piece, you said identified there are 4 main themes that were drawn out from that thematic analysis of the experts' reflections. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So I think as we were exploring this work, we were just aware that there weren't many case studies out there. There weren't many examples of when things went wrong. And that's often for a number of reasons. I think as soon as a process is over, organisations want to move on, individuals want to move on. It's just so uncomfortable for everybody. And yet experts like Sydney Decker from Just Culture talk about that's the key point at which to learn, because you've gone through the awful trauma and pain for everybody. It's closed, and the danger is everybody moves on so quickly and then doesn't capture the lessons from it. And then of course the even bigger tragedy then is if you don't capture the lessons, you repeat them all again the next time. And then of course from the other side, for those cases that are particularly challenging and that go all the way to potentially a tribunal, often non-disclosure agreements are signed and organisations move on. And then of course there's no opportunity for learning there either. So the Alex case study within the paper was just an opportunity to walk with someone who had gone through an experience to try and understand it from their perspective. And in truth, going back to patient safety, over the last 20-30 years, there's been an increased focus on understanding the patient's journey through the system. What does it look like? What does it feel like to the individual? And again, we really need to do that much more with our employees to actually understand if we are putting them through processes and recognizing that we're all operating in imperfect systems and that we all are imperfect, that no process is going to be painless or harmless, shouldn't we have an interest to know how it's impacting somebody? Shouldn't we want to know, well, if we do this or we don't do that, it's going to lead to X or Y? So that was the purpose in terms of using that case study, and then working with colleagues, identifying some of the main themes that came out of that experience. That as we've shared that case study, the resonance has been incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
People in the room will say, either I've been through that process, or they'll say, I've contributed to that process because I didn't respond in a timely way, because I cancelled 3 or 4 meetings because my workload was so challenging. And they actually kind of see then the impact of what a busy diary for them, legitimately so, but how it then impacts on the person they've taken through a process.
Mm.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I mean, all to add is, at a very, Alex is a real person. In my 9 years in my current post, I've lost track of how many other Alexes there are. So, that it's important to hold that idea that these people have not had a voice in this process. So I think that symbolically is incredibly powerful. But Alex's voice is also a very powerful device for us, because it helps highlight the relevance of the impact at least the entry point. And then people can start to see the bigger picture once you walk around. But we're emotional beings. We're moved by emotional stories. Advertisers know that full well.
Mm-hmm.
So there has been some crafting around that story, but the evidence is the evidence, and we use it, I think, quite effectively in the training, because it increases relevance and makes people think. It activates the bit of them that makes them want to do things differently. But I would never want that voice to be lost.
And I think it's a really interesting observation about, needing to learn from the experience once something's happened, rather than just move on as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of a conversation I was having recently with an organisation where some people in managerial positions were saying, this event has happened and we need to learn from it. And there's a lot to be learned. And actually, we need to do that in order to be able to move forward in a really healthy way, make sure we do change behaviours. But there was so much resistance also to revisiting, because people assume that if you're going to revisit something, it's going to feel traumatic all over again. It's going to be all associated with all the negative emotions that were experienced at the time. And it's really hard for people to understand that by revisiting, you're not going through the pain again. You're having someone walk you through the experience, but in framing it in a different way, which is about, we are learning from it. This is change, positive change is going to happen. It's for a positive purpose now. But that's a hard shift for some people to make, isn't it? And certainly it hasn't been ironed out in that particular organisation. And I don't think they're unique. I think there's that sort of tension, that conflict within organisations between some people who really want to visit and some people like just keeping the door shut on it.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, this reminds me of some of the conversation we had this morning at the Cardiff Business School. And I was, being a psychologist and chirping up and saying, look, if we're emotional beings before we're logical beings, it stands to reason that we're going to put a lot of energy into managing our emotions. And actually, we're not very good at it very often. So we may deploy some slightly more clumsy or crude ways of shutting things down, avoiding affect, almost. And that might shape culture. That might shape an approach to something maybe braver, but maybe more uncomfortable. We don't like discomfort. We don't like uncertainty. So I think this is the landscape, and it probably explains a lot of why weird things happen and strange behaviors get played out in systems. But Mm.
So tell me a little bit more about the I think you call it the employee experience framework. I mean, tell me a little bit more. Adrian, you're chuckling. Why are you chuckling?
That's left to field, but it's relevant, I guess. Andrew, you came talking about this? All right. So this thing we call the employee experience framework it was back in 2019. My then boss, the director of workforce, said we need something a bit radical that might try and help us with both wider well-being, and I'm not talking about yoga and ice baths, i.e. engagement, meaning, purpose, all the evidence-based stuff, and engagement. We want people, and engagement being obviously the other end of the scale to burnout, because we know there's a big problem with that. So myself and some colleagues from OD developed this framework, and rather than have a policy for well-being or a policy for engagement, which no one ever looks at, we built an operational tool that was kind of distilled from 3 different theoretical models. Ironically, one of them is the model that underpins the compassionate leadership model, the Deci and Ryan self-determination theory. So nice, theoretically based, brought together as a series of 6 conditions, if you like, or 6 factors, pillars they were called, that might underpin a healthier culture or a better experience of work. And that's where the employee experience framework was kind of developed. Then the pandemic hit, and the proverbial hit the fan, and we had to get on with things. So we're just bringing it back out now. But essentially, and this is where I forget all 6, but I'll do my best. So we're talking about 6 core conditions that all humans in an occupational setting need in varying degrees, but are great indicators of psychological health and organizational well-being and high engagement. So I'll read them out to you. So my work is purpose. I have enough control. I feel cared for. I have a sense of belonging. There we go. My work is valued and I'm fairly treated. So we basically say, look, we don't know the answer. Everyone's job's a bit different. Everyone's built slightly differently, but we know that these are great pillars to build your experience of work around. So that has now been built into people's annual reviews. So everyone who does the performance review has to respond to questions along those lines. And in theory, if there's a half decent relationship with a manager, you can talk about that and you can work out where you're at with it. It's also been used as a underpinning for a national tool. So we've called it the the Wellbeing Conversation Guide. It's a bit euphemistic, but we built it into a 4-stage tool for managers to use with people, with guides and prompts, which is located in the Welsh Government ESR, which is a tool that people can access for training. So it's grown and grown and grown, but it's the same stuff as we're all trying to get to identify what the core conditions to thrive at. I don't think it's the answer, but it's definitely more the answer than doing nothing or looking in a bit more linear way.
So it is a bit left field from what we were talking about in terms of employee harm, but actually those pillars are really essential, aren't they, for reducing employee harm, because we've got to have people. I mean, what you've just listed, those core pillars, really overlap with the Human Givens Institute emotional needs. And I use an emotional needs audit quite a lot, whether I'm working with individuals or teams, organizations, which is all around meaning and purpose and feeling recognized and valued and connected and so on. And we know that that's what is critical for our own well-being, for that of others. And we need that as your kind of foundation if we're looking at how to reduce harm and enable people to thrive. We've got to have it's the soft skills, it's all that stuff around our emotional needs that we've got to get right. So I think it's really important to kind of connect those.
But I think the avoidable harm stuff, sorry, Andrew, I'll shut up definitely in a sec, taps directly into that sense of fairness and control, I think. because these processes leave people completely without control. And also they often feel deeply unfair, and that, you know, that has really corrosive effect. Sorry, Andrew, go for it.
No, not at all. I mean, just in terms of reflecting on them, those are the measures that not only identify how somebody's feeling about the workplace, but it's also the culture and the environment that the workplace is creating, isn't it? So kind of linking into Lisa's point, it's doing those two measures incredibly well. Yes, the person sitting in front of you, this is how they are feeling, operating and experiencing work. But actually taking a step back, it's a real measure in terms of what kind of organisation are they working and operating in, and those areas in terms of control and belonging certainly go to the heart sometimes in terms of the investigation process, because it actually leaves people very much on the outside. And certainly in terms of our work there, we've really had two phases to this work. It's first been around making sure that we only investigate those that needs to be investigated, so we bring the number down. But the second phase is very much around how do we look after somebody who is going through that process, who has to go through that process. And we've got lots that we need to be doing and lots to learn from that. But again, we often talk about employee wellbeing experience through kind of the day-to-day, but actually, well, the investigation process is really an opportunity to really land this in a very focused, targeted and impactful way too. So absolutely they fit together.
Yeah. And just picking up on your point, Andrew, and this is, so one of the ideas, I guess, if we go back to those conditions, if you look at belonging, but also feeling valued, this is a conversation that Andrew and I had a while back, but very much Andrew's idea. But what work do we do to reintegrate people back in after these processes? Often they've been off for months. Often it's like someone's dropped a hand grenade in their team. It's often their manager that has put them through this process. So how do you, and I don't think there's any work on structurally bringing someone back into the system, or even considering whether it's possible. People are just like, it's over, get back to work now. And
that's never going to work.
It's never going to work, but people are expected to do it.
We certainly saw in terms of Alex's story that Alex had a suspected diagnosis of PTSD 14 months after the investigation had concluded. So it's not even in the period of the investigation, it's significantly into the future. And sometimes that's why it is important for organisations to understand the impact that their processes are having on an individual, not just for the individual's sake, but actually putting somebody back damaged as a result of that process can leave people feeling very bitter, corrosive, not being a team player for a whole host of legitimate reasons. But actually, as Adrian said, just to drop them back in and kind of expect everything to go back to as it was, it's a fairy tale, really. It's just not possible, and it's unreasonable of organisations to expect that. So how we move this work forwards, that if people go through a process, that they don't lose their job, and that, you know, the whole focus is about bringing them back in. We really ought to be reprioritizing that as being far more important than we've ever considered it before. Like I said, not just for them, but actually the potential damage to teams and kind of wider organizational well-being and culture is critical.
So I would love to hear from both of you as we wrap up what your key takeaways would be that you would like anyone listening to this, but particularly people in leadership position who have got a greater degree of influence. What should they be taking away and maybe thinking about doing differently based on what you two have shared with us today? Maybe I'll come to you first, Adrian.
So I'm not going to steal Andrew's tagline. You go for your tagline. It's a quick win. Okay, so gonna step out and up a little bit. So I'm going to be thinking. So I'm thinking. So if I'm speaking to senior leaders, I'd be saying, well, what is really important to you? And if the conversation says, oh, our staff are our greatest asset, blah blah blah, I'd be saying, okay, well, how willing are you to change how we do business to protect them? And that's, to me, would be the driver. And then I would be saying, could we make employee experience a priority, and not at the cost to patient experience, but could we raise that as a priority and do it in a much more strategic and more courageous way? Because in the NHS, that gets you into political tricky water. But that's what I'd be saying is, how seriously do you want to do this?
Good questions. Thank you, Adrian. Andrew.
So for me, it really is that focus on understanding what the impact is in order to support change. I guess in a nutshell, over the last year, we've identified that employee investigations, they're just too costly. They are too costly on so many levels. So if you need to do one, make sure you really need to do it. We've got a line that we are really championing within NHS Wales: make employee investigations the last resort. Our exec team have signed up for that. Colleagues across NHS Wales are signing up for it. They just cost too much. So if you need to do them, make sure that they are the last resort.
That's brilliant. That's powerful. And I like the fact that people are signing up to that.
Yeah.
Love it. Before I let you two go, I'm going to ask you a blind question, which is completely off-piste. And Andrew, I'm going to start with you, seeing as Adrian was in the hot seat just now to go first with his good advice. So Roy Magara from Magara Law, who I spoke with recently, has asked this question: what is one career, even if you were paid £1 million, that you would not do? This is where Adrian's like, phew, about 8, and just go first. So what's one career that even if you were paid £1 million you would not do? You can thank Roy for that one.
So the first thing that's sprung to mind was a financial analyst, because numbers and figures are just not my bag. Where would you start if that's not your comfort zone, your experience? So yeah, I think so. I might come back with another one after Adrian though.
Go
on, Adrian.
Crumbs. The mind boggles. So I'm not going to name a job because I'm trying to avoid it. But I would go with anything that means I lose sight of what's important to me. No money in the world is worth that, because it'll destroy me. And that's a bit dramatic, but there'll be a price, and I don't think I need that price. So yeah.
Like it. I can see Andrew's deep in thought now. But that's a really hard question, isn't it? But it just makes, I think, asking a question like that and thinking about what your answer is really good for us, just reflecting on why we do what we do.
Yeah.
And that's good, because sometimes, you two strike me as the sort of people who are very clear about why you do what you do and what difference you want to make and so on. But I think so many people are in jobs where it's like, why am I doing this? And just revisiting that is a good one. Yeah. So thank you both so much for your time today. I have really enjoyed this conversation because you've positioned it in quite a different way to previous conversations I've had about employee experience and compassionate leadership and so on. And although your work is based within the NHS, it is so transferable to any sector, really, any industry. So there are valuable lessons. As I've been scribbling lots of notes, and I'm thinking I must remember to have this conversation or share this episode of the podcast with these particular people, because I think there's so much that they'll gather from it. So a huge thank you to you both. And we will put any links to resources, the paper about Alex, and anything else that you got that might be useful to share in the show notes. So thank you.
Thank you for suggesting it, Lisa. Great idea.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation today. I invite you to think about one thing that you will take away to think about or do differently. I'd be really grateful if you can give me a thumbs up on Apple or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and for an extra brownie point, leave me a short review. I'm really keen to help drive real change for better practice in the world of people at work, and spreading the message will help that. I'd love you to also join the club to stay in the loop and be the first to hear about exciting things that I'm developing, including free downloadable resources. Please do reach out to me directly to discuss the topics covered on this podcast, or perhaps other challenges around people at work. And if we're not already acquainted on LinkedIn, please connect. All the links you need are in the show notes. So until next time, bye for now.